It's a beautiful morning outside, a beautiful morning to be gathered inside, but at least we can look outside and get a little glimpse of the created beauty of the world rather than the more sterile context within which we sit in order to worship. I introduced these chapel talks yesterday just briefly by saying we'll be doing a biblical theology applied particularly to the arts. And I failed to introduce you to the three key words that we'll be using to kind of take an overview of this biblical theology. I assure you they're very simple words, and yet if you were to ask someone, what is the Bible about? This would be one way of saying, this is what the Bible is about. So, you ask me what the Bible is about, one of the ways I could respond to that is by saying, it's about God who created a world of beauty and goodness. But something happened in this world of beauty and goodness that we call the fall. The fall was tragic. It left the beauty and goodness of God's created world marred. And that fall impacted all facets of creation. Nothing exempted. The primary theme coming out of that context is then this God at work in his created world to salvage, to redeem, to make whole again that which was fallen, that which is broken, that which is marred. And when we wrap up the story of the Bible, we wrap up this story, we get a glimpse of a day that's coming where everything is going to be put back to rights again. And God himself will be at the center of his creation, and it will all be fully ordered around him, by him, and for his glory. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a magnificent story. And what's so beautiful about this story is that as we experience life day to day, the more familiar we are with this story of creation, fall, and redemption, the more we're able to make sense out of our stories. The better we're able to understand how this God who created us, this God from which we have fallen, how this God is at work in our world, in our circumstances, in our relationships, and inside of each of us personally to salvage, redeem, to make whole, to bring beauty back to the created goodness. And it gives us a reason to get up in the morning, even when we don't feel like it. It gives us a reason to say, "Soul, thou must be waking." And of course, it gives us one of the means for bodily waking, coffee. And I know some of you have not had your coffee, and my sympathies go out particularly to Wendell. He uses other means for waking in the morning. So we're breaking these three themes of Scripture, creation, fall, and redemption, each of them into two chapel talks. The first two we're going to be looking at creation. What is it about creation that helps us to understand not only who we are, but what this world is in which we live? What is it about creation, what God has said about creation, that helps us to understand our own creative impulses and urges? Because you all have them. Because you're image bearers of this creative God. So we're going to spend the first two chapel talks talking about creation. The next two, we're going to do the harder part, and that is look at the fall. How has this distortion and brokenness now impacted creation? And as creatures of God's creation, how has it impacted us? The last two chapel talks will then be looking at redemption. What does it mean for God to be a redeemer, interacting with his creation, to salvage it from ruin, from slavery, from all the other biblical metaphors that describe the ruin we're in, to make something new, something beautiful, and something of restored goodness? What's that process look like, and how does that inform who we are as creative creatures of this God? And then Sunday morning, Lord willing, in our wrap-up session, we'll talk about what does it mean to be renewed creatures with a renewed zeal, a renewed vision for the redemptive work of Jesus in the world, particularly as people with an artistic bent and orientation. Now, I'm sure most of you, on your way here this morning, observed something of beauty. You are in the Shenandoah Valley. Okay, so unless you had a blindfold on, you saw some beautiful things. We won't talk about how that's marred, particularly in this area. We can talk for long periods of time about that. But you saw beautiful things. Some of you actually saw the sunrise, likely. For those of you that weren't watching the stars half the night. Some of you saw some beautiful flowers and birds. And I'm sure you all saw trees. Think with me just a bit about the trees just here in the valley. If you pay careful attention to the trees, you know that there are many different kinds of trees. Most trees we think green leaves. Most of them have green foliage of some sort. And yet, how many different shades of green do you see in a typical forest? Okay, more greens than you knew existed. And for all those different shades of green, there are a myriad different shapes of the greenery. And an innumerable number of shapes of trees. Each tree has its individual shape. Each tree is shaped partially by its circumstances. So a tree that was planted out in the pasture field is shaped differently than a tree that's planted up in the mountains somewhere. They've grown differently. So God's creation is at work, shaping, reshaping, and sometimes even destroying certain facets of creation. It's a complex world. It's a complex creation in which we live. And yet there is so much beauty. We see it immediately. So I told you this past Saturday, I was in Belleville, Pennsylvania. Well, on the way back, I popped up across Jack's Mountain, and I went flying by the overlook, and I said, you know, I need to get back. Wendell's going to cause me trouble if I don't, but I'm going to stop anyhow. And I did a U-turn in the middle of the road, went back up to the overlook on Jack's Mountain, and I just spent a few minutes looking out across Big Valley. It was spectacular. There was not a cloud in the sky, and the valley was absolutely beautiful. But I had also been down on one of the farms and looked very closely at one of the little gardens. I didn't see that from Jack's Mountain, but I saw the big sweeping beauty. And you know, that's the way this world is. You can get into an airplane, fly for hours, and see a magnificent vista. But then you can land the airplane, walk off the tarmac, out into the gardens, the cultivated areas, from there, deeper into the wilderness. And you can pause and sit down in the wilderness and begin to explore even the earth, pulling aside the rotted leaves, and you begin to see life. You begin to see details to the creation. And people have spent lifetimes, entire lifetimes, exploring what is hidden in this created world. Where, folks, where did all this come from? Why is it here? How can we know? Maybe, in fact, we can't. But then, maybe we can. Where did all this beauty, in all its complexity, come from? As Christians, one of the ways we understand our world is that the one who made it has spoken. And he's told us some of the things that we could never figure out simply by looking at trees and flowers, flying through space, or being great philosophers and asking great questions, which incidentally is one of the reasons philosophers and scientists get rather annoyed about the whole topic of God. Because their best skills at knowing that they employ, the philosopher through great inquiry, asking the best questions, that means of knowing can never lead you to the knowledge of God. The scientist, with all his advanced skills for exploring the created world, while there are clues there that someone made it, we can never ultimately know this God with all the best scientific tools. But this God, this Creator God, has spoken. And he's spoken in a way that we can hear it and get it and understand it. He has disclosed himself. He has revealed himself. And one of the ways in which he's done that is through Scripture. So when we open the book that he's given to us over a period of hundreds and hundreds of years through his creatures, the opening line says, "In the beginning, God created." So one of the first things we know about this God is he's a creator God. He doesn't start by saying, in the beginning there was a God who was omnipotent, omniscient, a God who was eternal. He doesn't lay out all these characteristics of who he is. He simply reveals himself as a God who makes things. A God who makes things. And in the middle of his story, his disclosure of himself to us, he says, by the way, there is nothing that's been made that I haven't made. Everything that exists is a part of my work. So think about it. As you're traveling through the Shenandoah Valley, if you have the opportunity to travel throughout the world, everything you see that exists ultimately was made by this God. He brought it into existence. Everything. There is nothing that exists that he's not made. Doesn't mean others haven't interfered with it, haven't given shape to it, haven't even marred it. But he created it. He is a creator. It's the first thing we know about him. The psalmist, in reflecting on this creator God, as he looks at what God has made, and he looks up into the vast expanses of the heavens, the skies, sees the stars, the planets, the moon, that whole realm of the universe, he says, those heavens, his creation is also speaking. In fact, is it's shouting out the glory of God. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork, his craftsmanship, his ability, his highly skilled abilities to make things. That's who this God is that has disclosed himself. There is a God who has created. And his creation is more than nature. Okay, you pick up the newspaper, you pick up many scientific journals. When they talk about the world in which we live, they love to talk about nature. Nature, by implication, is natural. Natural, by implication, is a result of some kind of natural organic processes. Creation, on the other hand, requires a creator. the heavens and the earth have been created. There's a creator who made them. And he makes things. Not just ordinary things like mud pies and sandcastles. He makes the universe, the galaxies, the stars, the planets, the sun. He makes a world that contains continents and oceans. He fills this world with all kinds of living things. Covers this world with rivers and oceans, mountains and deserts, and then populates them with dogs and cats and spiders and lice and many other things, including people. And this God, in his creative process, allows us to see a reflection of who he is by what he makes. So someday, if you have children, you have grandchildren, you have nieces, you have nephews who get together at family reunions, and they talk about you once you're gone, maybe gone for 2 generations. One of the ways by which they will know you is by the things you've made. Okay, I was in Belleville, as I told you, at a family reunion. Hadn't been there for 21 years. Had never been to this family reunion. I'm getting to the age now when I realize this stuff does actually matter. And so I made extra efforts to get there. And the afternoon after lunch, the stories surrounded what my great-grandpa, for those of you who know Dutch, he was known as E-Armig Cho. For those of you who don't, One-Arm Joe. Because 6 months after he got married, he got his arm caught in some farm equipment and lost his arm and was left with a wooden arm with a metal hook on the end. And how do I know One-Arm Joe, my great-grandfather who I never met, who died years before I was born? Well, when my mother had her first birthday, actually, she was 1 year old, and it was at Christmas time. He made something for his granddaughter. He made a little wooden rocking horse, cut out 2 horses, built a seat in between, the dowel rod, rockers on the bottom, painted it up beautifully. And this has been part of our family history. So when I think One-Arm Joe, it's easy for me to get that he had a hook on one arm. But with a hook on one arm and one good hand, he made that. And I found out he made lots of other things. So we have one other treasure. He made a little rack, and there's technical language for this that I don't know, and a set of harnesses for the family dog. And he had it built so that it could be attached to the little red wagon. And he was the leather craftsman as well. And so the family dog could be used like a horse in the little red wagon. And the grandkids could get up, lassie, and go out the driveway to get the mail. And the dog would pull the little red wagon out to the mailbox. And so we have that he made. And as I look at that, there's a lot I get to know about who One-Arm Joe was. He left a legacy by what he created. We know God in some measure by what he created. So when we observe his handiwork, we observe his creation, we get to know something about him. Now, we're not going to take the time to read Genesis 1. We're going to assume you know what Genesis 1 says. But I want to point some things out about Genesis 1. We also know something about someone by their creative process, how they go about making things. So as soon as we know that One-Arm Joe only had one hand, we begin to ask questions. How did he make this rocking horse? How did he manage that? This is very different than for a man with 2 hands, or for a man who had, electric band saws and sanders and all the latest tools. No, this was back in the early 40s, and he was an old order Amish man without electricity. So how did he, with the resources he had, make this rocking horse? By what process? And interestingly enough, in very poetic language, the writer of Scripture tells us the kind of process God took, the kind of creative process he undertook in making the universe and the world in which we live. There's a rhythm, there's a pattern to this creative process detailed in Genesis 1. And it goes like this. First of all, there's the creative word. And God said. Now, I don't know how many of you have tried to speak things into existence. But if you get married, don't try it with your spouse. Okay? It's called micromanaging. Using your spouse as a puppet. Hey, would you make me a cup of coffee? Now, just get off the recliner, go make your cup of coffee. Okay? Unless it's voluntarily offered. God, different story. Starts with nothing, speaks things into existence, causes them to exist by his spoken word. And notice what the author does next. He next reports the effect of the spoken word. And guess what? It always comes into existence. God says, "Let there be light." The report says, "And there was light." And he does that all the way through Genesis chapter 1. And we begin to say, wow, this God is an incredible God. He speaks reality into existence. That's amazing. Well, guess what happens next? In each of these 6 incidents, he not only speaks and it happens, he then steps back, just like all craftspeople do, and artists and tradesmen. They step back and they assess what happened. They assess what they've done. Okay, I love building furniture, and it's been years since I built any. But when you get that piece of furniture finished, you step back and you look at it. Here's the way my thought process goes. Man, I wish I'd have done that. You know, that's a little crooked. That's a little rough there. I really like that, but I'm going to have to practice my skills on that just a little bit better. You know that assessment process? And I do have, confession time, a certain perfectionist orientation, so that I've never built anything that I could say I was fully pleased. I've never preached a sermon that I was fully pleased with. I always scratch my head and say, that didn't work. This was okay, that wasn't great. I don't know that I've ever done anything that I said, behold, it was very good. Except maybe go to bed at night. But God is the kind of artist, the kind of craftsman, the kind of creator that with a standard of absolute perfection and infinite possibility, every time he says, good, 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 day 6, looks at the whole package, and he adds the word very good. No flaws. Beauty. Order. Harmony. Everything complete. Good. Good. And then he numbers the day. Day 1, the evening and the morning, the first day. Evening and the morning, the 6th day. He even got his work done on time. This God, Creator God, is a God of perfection who creates perfectly, assesses it perfectly, and is completely satisfied that what he has done is exactly the way it ought to be. You get to know an awful lot about this God just from that simple story of a creative process. You also get to know a lot about this God by the way he documents it for us and gives it to us in its literary form. You don't read Genesis 1 like some kind of science textbook. It reads like poetry. It's beautiful literature. There are the cadences of music in that chapter, the rhythms of beauty. So he's not just content to give us a simple narrative of what took place. He says, let me give it to you in spellbinding language. And he does. Notice the order of creation. It's not a random series of events. Day 1, he creates light. Day 2, he creates an atmosphere, separates waters into livable spaces. Day 3, he creates dry land. Day 4, he steps back, and where the light was created day 1, he revisits that light and details it out. Sun, moon, and stars. Day 4, he steps back and revisits the atmosphere and its separation, and he fills the skies with birds. And he fills the seas with fish. And day 6, he revisits the dry land he created in day 3 and fills it with livestock and animals. All kinds of creeping creatures, even the ones you find down in the marsh beds. Fills it up, fills it with life. And then finally crafts carefully the managers for this new planet. God the Creator is a master creator. He actively creates, and in so doing, he demonstrates from the very beginning the entire creative process for his image-bearing creatures, for us. And what he says about us that he doesn't say about any of his other creatures is we're created in his image. And I want you to think about, what do we know about this God at this point? He's a creator God. And so we must immediately assume that if we bear his image, we too are creative creatures. He makes stuff out of nothing. We take stuff, his stuff, and make stuff. There are fancy words for that, but that's the nuts and bolts of it. We don't start with nothing. If we start with nothing, we end with nothing. God started with nothing and ended up with something. Okay, we can't do that. We start with the something that God made, and we exercise our creative processes, and we have things that didn't previously exist that are shaped, flavored, constructed according to our capacities, our abilities, our insights, and are a product of who we are that can be studied to know something about us, about who we are. There's a value to this creation, but there's also beauty and goodness. I want you to notice something else about his creation. God's creation, and I've alluded to this earlier, is kind of immediately accessible in its beauty. So if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, you know, if you drive up maybe to the south side or you pull up to the north side of the canyon, you walk out and it's just like breathtaking. The vastness of this canyon. The beauty of its colors. But if you have the time, and as Americans, most of us don't have the time. We want to see the Grand Canyon, want to take it all in maybe 15 minutes, so we can get on to the next thing, check it off too. Haven't seen that as well. But if you have the time, and you were to start hiking down the side of the Grand Canyon, and you hiked all the way down, you camped down there, you hiked along the Colorado River, you observed the canyon from many different places, and finally, after a few days, you climbed all the way back out of the canyon. Let's just say you would have seen the canyon in a different way. And so you meet someone and you say to them, "Hey, have you seen the Grand Canyon?" "Yeah, I did. Isn't it spectacular?" "Oh, what did you see?" Oh, big hole in the ground. Was there for 15 minutes. And you say to them, wait a minute, you haven't you haven't really seen the Grand Canyon. Okay, and we can say that about most anything. Shenandoah Valley, the Shenandoah River, young men, about the lady you love, work at it for 30 years, you still won't really have seen anything. You know more, you don't know it all. There's more to be seen, more to be discovered, more to be known. That's the nature of God's creation. There's something immediately accessible, but if you pause, you take the time, there's more to be seen. There's more to be discovered. And while the creation is finite, it feels almost infinite when we begin the exploration and discovery of God's creation. Think about just the universe. The vastness of space. Ever since people have been created, at night they've been looking out into the universe and seeing things. And many people have seen far more than most of us will ever see. They've observed. They've noticed. They've begun to make sense out of what's going on out there. Because there's an order to that complexity. Because this God is a God of order. The Persian astronomers, living in the deserts without electric street lights all around them, observed the night skies very carefully. So carefully, in fact, that they said to each other, hey, there was a king born in Palestine. Let's go find him. And how did they figure it out? Stars. And so they went. We have the Hubble telescope out in space. And we're seeing things that weren't previously seen. But guess what? That telescope is getting just a small little slice of the universe. We can spend a lot of time, put out a lot more telescopes. There's a lot more to be discovered. The planet on which we live is just like that. And again, as Americans, we like to do Europe in 10 days. Today's Tuesday, so it must be Belgium. Tomorrow's Wednesday, so it must be France. And then we come back, and somebody says, hey, have you ever been to France? Yeah, I've been to France. Versus the person who spent a year in Provence. Okay, they've been to France too. But that's the nature of our whole universe that God made. And its secondary creative achievements through his creatures. And I want you to notice a pattern that's developing here. God created a universe. He also created a galaxy. Within that galaxy, he created a planet. And on that planet, he created a wilderness, vast wildernesses. But in Genesis 2, we read that in that wilderness, he planted a garden. A garden. And then in that garden, he put creative creatures made in his own image, to manage it, to take care of it, and to expand the garden as they multiplied across the planet. You see, we aren't creatures created for wilderness. We're creatures created for culture. We've been given the mandate to make something out of what God has made, to make gardens, to build houses, to bring a refined beauty into our homes, into our spaces, to live there as his creative creatures, and ultimately, as the populations grow, to build cities and towns. to become, if you will, experts, specialists, so that societies can flourish. And we're to do that as creatures of God, image-bearing creatures of God, creating out of what He's already made. It's a fine-tuning process that we've been called to. This fine-tuning of the creation God has made for an enhanced quality of life, for intimate places of rest and fellowship, of beauty and belonging, places we call home. Now, there is a certain set of people who lives very comfortably and for recreation goes to the wilderness. They love doing without creature comforts, claim to. Instead of living in a house that's air conditioned, they'll sleep in a plastic tent. Instead of the fine facilities of our modern restrooms, they have trees and stumps and branches and twigs and creeks. But rarely do you find someone who loves to make that home. You see, we're being rescued from our lives of wandering and brought to places of rest and beauty. This pattern is exhibited throughout Scripture in other themes. God lives initially apart from a created world. He pre-existed creation. He didn't need it. But then He walks with man in a garden. Then He invites men to build a tabernacle in which He will live. And then a temple. And finally, God Himself embodies the highest form of His creation, the human body. God indwells creature in order that eventually we inhabit God again. So in the closing lines of Scripture, we find there is no temple now. God Himself is the temple, and we dwell in His temple. Notice the order, the progression of what's taking place here. Notice the parallel also of God's creative process to our own creative processes. Our own creative processes always begin with an idea. And I well recall, particularly one of our children, at a very young age, their line was, "Have idea." That was a warning to mom, look out. But you know, that's who we are. We're creatures, we have ideas. And that's where it starts. We have ideas. When we have these ideas, when we hatch these ideas, we pull together the resources for the ideas. And sometimes that's where the idea stops because we can't acquire the resources. Okay? God had idea. God compiled the resources. Genesis 1, the earth is without form and void. The construction, lumber, the pile, the raw materials is present. We follow the same process. We have idea. We compile resources. We create an outline, a blueprint, a foundation, a backdrop to what it's going to take to fulfill this idea. And then we lay down the foundation. We paint the whole backdrop. We plaster it on. We have to start with that. We don't start with the fine details. We build the foundation. This is the creative process in all of our endeavors. And then we finish it. And while the professional distinguishes himself from the amateur, in each of these steps, it's ultimately in the quality of the finish that the true professional demonstrates his skills. Now, the true professional, his ideas tend to be better as well. He tends to have the kind of resources he can get together and so forth and so on. But this is the pattern. And it's true in all the disciplines of our creative processes. Exactly what God did in Genesis 1. It's the way we go about it. I will recall one of the light bulb moments for me. Oldest son composes music, and he spent a week in a workshop with Alice Parker. And when he came back, I said, so what did you learn from Miss Parker? And he said, probably the most beneficial thing I learned was that when you're starting with the text, so you're composing a choral piece, you write out the text, and she taught us how to just start drawing lines to show how the text flows in its emphasis. So you begin to draw lines that show the ebb and flow of the text. You work to select where the text climaxes, and you start noting that with some sketches. And you have this whole visual kind of drawing of text and how it might begin to express itself musically. And I'm thinking, I just finished a course in architectural drafting. And what I was taught that the best approach to architecture, you have to first know where it's going to be, because the location matters. And now one of the things that annoys me most, and I walked away from a house I really should have bought, because it annoyed me. The house, somebody had an idea of a house, and I can just imagine that this beautiful lot, magnificent lot, beautiful views, and they bought a set of blueprints. And they looked through the blueprints and said, oh, I like that house. So they said to the builder, we love this spot, and we like that house. Put that house on this spot. It's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. Now, I could go in the house and I could like the house if you just didn't show me where it was. I could stand on the lot without the house and say, what a magnificent building site. But you put the two together and it's a disaster. So the architectural drafting class, he basically said, find your spot, stand on your spot, and you begin to draw a bubble chart of the various rooms, of the various pieces of the finished product, and where each of these should be positioned, given the location. So when you go to bed and you wake up in the morning, which way do you want this, what do you want to see when you wake up? Or when you're dining, what do you want to see when you're dining? When the wife is in the kitchen, and she's the one that ought to be there washing the dishes, not me, but when she's there working in the kitchen, what do you want her looking at? And you just start with this collection of circles, and you keep moving them around until you get the best flow for the site. Okay, then you start saying, okay, now how can we make this effectively work architecturally? What do the roof lines look like? And you build it from the ground up. And of course, now I assess every property on every piece of land, every house. Does it work or doesn't it? And half of them don't. Okay, and I'll probably end up living in a house that doesn't. But that's part of the price of poverty. Sermons are the same way, incidentally. Very same way. Crafting a piece of music is the same thing. Painting a work of art, same basic process. And sometimes I get closer to finish with a sermon than other times. And when I get closer to finished, there are days when I will have spent several hours finding the right word or words that communicate most powerfully, most poetically, and in a most memorable way the key idea of a sermon. So you listen to the greatest preachers. What distinguishes them is the fine-tuning of the final product. But it's cohesive all the way back through. There's complete alignment with the text of Scripture to the way it's brought to bear on the life today. And it's done so in a way that captivates, shapes, influences, inspires, and calls to worship. Same thing's true for a finely crafted piece of art, whether music or painting or literary work. This God communicates. He's given us Scripture, which shouldn't surprise us, is the crowning work of literature in our world. Not just because we say so, its qualities mark it as that. He communicates, and this infinite one speaks and has spoken to finite ones. The omniscient one teaches the learning ones. And the Apostle John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. As you engage in the creative process today, remember you do so because you're created, intentionally, thoughtfully created in the image of the ultimate Creator. You're a tool in his hands, but you're a living tool. And you get to bring shape to what you do. May you do so with wisdom. Let's pray. Lord, guide us in wisdom as creative creatures of your creative work. May you be glorified through our work today. For Jesus' sake we pray.